Good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking out the time for joining the Decoding the Union Budget 2024 webinar. My name is Nidhi, and I'm the Vice President Market Insights for Wealth and Personal Banking at HSBC India. Before we begin with the webinar, I would like to set a few tone for the Union Budget this year. Last year's budget were known as dexterous match, something that balanced capex and fiscal prudence very evidently. This year, too, the budget didn't disappoint in terms of maintaining the discipline in terms of maintaining fiscal deficit trajectory, as well as going ahead with the focused capex expenditure. While we have all read about the various policies that have been announced in the budget, be it creation of employment, be it upskilling, be it facilitating credit for MSME, to better understand the line of thought that string all these policy measures together, we have with us with an expert. I would like to welcome Ms. Pranjul Bhandari, who is the Chief Economist for India and Indonesia for HSBC. Previously, she has worked with India's Ministry of Finance and at the Planning Commission and has a rich experience of working with organizations and institutions across the globe. She's an industry stalwart, and it's a pleasure to hear her views on the economy. Over to you, Pranjul.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nidhi, for having me, and thank you everybody for joining the call. And I know there's been a information overload on the budget, so thank you still for joining. And I hope that the next couple of minutes will be useful for you, and I'll try to make it concise. Now, look, a couple of things really struck me about this budget. In particular, I think it had a huge amount of fiscal prudence and also financial vigilance, and I think both were the need of the day. And let me sort of take one at a time, fiscal prudence. I think what has really struck me is how this government, despite all kinds of pressures, post-pandemic issues, elections, climate change, drought, year after year has stuck to its promise of bringing down the fiscal deficit in a way that if at this point of time it reaches its target of FY26 at 4.5% of fiscal deficit, it would have reduced the fiscal deficit by 2% of GDP in a matter of 3 years. This is actually huge. This kind of consolidation is politically not possible for many governments. So it's great that we are being able to do this. You may ask, why do we even need to do it? And it's a very fair question. Why do we need to bring down government imbalances? Many reasons. Number one, that's the only way you can bring down public debt over time. It's the only way you can bring down interest rates over the time. And it's the only way in which more funds are available for the private sector. You don't want all the funds to be taken up and captured by the government, right? Because at the end of the day, 80% of investment is led by the private sector. Only 20% is by the government. So you need enough out there at a low rate available for the private sector to be able to start a new capex cycle and create growth and create jobs. And that's why bringing fiscal deficit is so important, bringing it down. So that was like this one winning stroke that they stuck to the fiscal consolidation path, which also means that their borrowing number is a bit lower. So the borrowing that the government will do in the next year has come out to be a bit lower. Some people in the debt market are complaining that it's not low enough. And I sympathize with that view. But the truth is, I think the government has been fairly conservative with its estimate. My sense is that tax revenues could be even higher than the government at this point has budgeted. We have this concept of tax buoyancy. It's assumed a tax buoyancy of 1.1. And last year, tax buoyancy was 1.4. And every year for the last 3 years, tax buoyancy has turned out to be more than the government has budgeted. And eventually, I think that, fiscal deficit could be even lower. And then the government will be able to cut market borrowing. So that's a hope out there. But I think there's a fair chance of that. The other thing I liked about the math was the RBI dividend. RBI a couple of weeks ago announced a large dividend to the government. It was 0.4% of GDP, higher than the government had anticipated. And there was a pretty, frenetic debate on how will this dividend be used. Will they just spend it, or will they save it? And if they spend it, where will they spend it? And I think the government was very judicious here. It basically used it half for spending and half for saving. So out of 0.4% of GDP, half was used for bringing down the fiscal deficit and half was used for increasing current expenditure. So I think it was a fair split given the state of the economy at this point of time. In terms of themes that I really liked about this budget, is the fact is that the capex theme of the government continued to dominate. There have been all kinds of sort of noises that no, capex was of the past. Now it's going to be all about increasing current expenditure. But yes, it did increase current expenditure, but not way too much. It's still a capex budget. And the number is very simple. The capex number is going to be rising by 17% year on year. And current expenditure, which is the non-capex expenditure, it has things like subsidies and so on and so forth, that's going to rise by 6% year on year. So capex growth is 3 times of current expenditure. So capex definitely dominates. And the other thing I like about capex is that it is actually broadening out compared to a couple of years ago. In the last 2 to 3 years, most of the capex was for railways and for roads. And you can't increase capacity very quickly. We were reaching sort of bottlenecks, but this time we are seeing it diversify to other areas like housing, like power, like urban infrastructure. So there are many areas where it's widening out to. Then the breakdown is also changing. Like, for example, 2 years ago, most of the capex the government was implementing on its own, but now about 40% of the capex bill, they're going to give to states as long-term interest-free loans, and the states can do the capex. This, I think, is great because the states are closer to the ground and they really, work on very micro capex projects like, waterways and things like that, which are very important. So you're giving the states a free hand, and it doesn't end there. The government is giving this money to the states, and it is saying, we'll give you this interest-free loan, but conditional on some reforms, which is great, right? You get a lot of reforms done. So you have like one stone, you have a pot of money. On the back of that, you get capex done, and you also get some reforms done. And the kind of reforms that the government is asking the states to do is things like digitizing land records, things that will only increase productivity and growth over time. So that was this sort of new capex that I think was very interesting. Then there's current expenditure. Now, current expenditure did rise a little bit by 0.2% of GDP more than we had anticipated back in February, but it was very focused. A part of it was higher transfers to states, no surprise, mostly Bihar and Andhra Pradesh. A part of it was on the job scheme, and I'm going to come back to that. And a part of it was on the price stabilization fund, which I think is very important given that food prices are really high at this point of time. In terms of some of the themes that were very important, of course, the jobs and skilling, numbers and quotes were in all the newspapers over the last 3 days. The government has given this umbrella amount of 2 trillion rupees over 5 years that's going to be, invested in jobs and skilling. Now, will this solve India's problem? No, because India's problem is just extremely large, and there is no magic wand, and there are no quick fixes. Everything we do is going to take a long time, and I think this is a 10-year-long challenge. But what it did was bring the conversation front and center in the budget, because I haven't seen this in the past, that jobs and skilling being the main focus of a budget. And I think this was a winning stroke. It's not the perfect answer. Many things are work in progress, but the seed has been sown, and we can only improve from here, right? And we can only learn from our mistakes. We can have some schemes, they don't work, we improve them, things like that. But at least we are starting to do that. So I think that was another very, winning stroke of this budget. Broadly speaking, it had some employment-linked schemes, like, for example, first-time workers in the formal sector will get a cash back of 1 month of their salary. This is important because the problem is, as soon as you go from the informal sector to the formal sector to get a job, a lot of your monthly salary gets cut. You have to put so much in PF, you have to put, something here, somewhere, something there, and they say na ki chitti wali salary itni hai, lekin haath wali salary kitni kam hai. That whole chitti wali and haath wali salary becomes an issue. So this was sort of a sweetener there, that no, come to the formal workforce and we will give you a cash transfer back. So some of these things were for the first time addressed. And then there was, of course, discussions on revamping skilling schemes, giving more education loans more freely, more free credit to MSMEs, which can be creators of jobs in the formal sector. So I think these were some of the things that they did. Of course, only time will tell, and hope we can improve upon these schemes. Another thing that I liked in this budget was simplification. They really thought about simplifying a lot of things. They have plans to simplify the GST tax structure. We have too many rates right now. We really need to narrow them out to one to two rates. We can't have 5 to 6 rates. That was the whole promise of GST: simpler, easy to comply. So the government has really spoken about trying to revisit all of their sort of GST rates. It plans to revisit some of the FDI norms, making it far more simpler than before. And it also wants to revamp the Income Tax Act. I think simplification is extremely welcome, and I hope they do it properly. They cut, every budget they've been talking about changes in import tariffs. And, honestly, as an economist, I don't like it, because every time you put an import tariff, it's like you're putting a tax on your exports. It feels like you're protecting some domestic industry, but over time, it's a slippery slope. You always say that, no, this is an import tariff only two products in which India needs to ramp up production. But before you know, two products become 30, 30 becomes 60, 60 becomes 120 products, and we end up taxing all our exports, because many of these imports are intermediate goods for our exports. So from that perspective, I think the fact that they cut down import tariff on some products like gold, silver, which in the past have been huge job creating sectors. We import gold, we create jewelry, and then we export it. So that has been extremely job creating. That was suffering because import taxes was just so high. So I'm very happy that many of the import tariffs were cut. But on the other hand, some others were increased, which is not great. But I'm hoping over time they realize that it's very important to have low and stable import tariffs in the economy. I've praised the budget a bit too much, I suppose. So let me talk about one or two things that I think was missing from the budget. I think what was missing was conversation on privatization and disinvestment. A couple of years ago, we privatized Air India. And I thought that was the start. And then, after elections, we would pick back the baton and do many more disinvestments. But unfortunately, somehow that has taken a back seat. Somehow the government is now more focused on improving the financials of their PSUs rather than disinvesting and selling it to the private sector. My personal view is that I think it's a wasted opportunity. Stock markets are so high. It's a good time to actually go out and do some disinvestments. You earn good money. And once these companies goes to private sector, there can be a lot of revamping, but the government doesn't agree with that at this point of time. So I do think privatization is something, and I hope they pick it back up over the next year or so. The other thing that I think was missing was more conversation on the production linked incentive, and I'm happy to talk about it later in Q&A if you would like. But our PLI scheme needs a lot of revamping. It needs a lot of simplification. We need to rethink about the focus. Is it only for high-tech sectors, or will it also be for mid-tech sectors like food processing, textiles, which can be more job creating than high-tech sectors? And indeed, if you want to bring it on for mid-tech sectors, then you really need to simplify some of the fine print, some of the norms. But I didn't sort of see any conversation of that in the budget. Hopefully, we have the next budget in 6 months. Hopefully that will come then, but I just hope it's not going to slip through the cracks. Finally, there was, financial vigilance, which I think was very welcome in the form of, we've had parts of the government, SEBI, RBI, the Ministry of Finance, in various forums speaking about how the equity market has really run up. And, the fact that they increased the capital gains tax, the fact that they've increased the STT in options trading, I think is a very clear message that they don't want valuations to become too far away from fundamentals. And I think from that perspective, this was not a bad step. Also, every year before the budget, it just becomes a big question mark. Will they raise capital gains tax or not? Will they not? Just doing it once and for all, puts that sort of uncertainty and debate to rest. So from that perspective too, I think it's sort of a good step. Finally, I'm going to just take 10 seconds more. What does all of this mean for growth? Now, every time you bring down the fiscal deficit, you basically, in a way, bring down fiscal spending, government spending, and it can be negative for growth. But this is a very unique year in which we are bringing down the fiscal deficit, but we are not really harming growth. And the reason for that is while we are bringing down many of our expenditures, we are actually improving the quality of the expenditure by things like Capex. And I can talk about that later. So we have this very rare situation in which we are doing fiscal consolidation, but it's not hurting growth because good quality spending impacts growth in a very, very positive way. So because we're increasing the quality of spend, we are still giving a positive push on growth from the government side. So it's great to see that the budget, despite all the fiscal consolidation, is still likely to have a positive impact on growth. This is sort of my long and short of the budget. I would love to hear your views, Nidhi, and take any questions.
Sure, Pranjul. I guess after hearing your concise views, I guess we all are happy that, we get to hear you because we have read so much about it, but putting things in perspective, how you kind of clearly differentiated how Capex is still three times of, your current expenditure, or talking about, job creation, or mentioning about disinvestment that I'm sure a lot of people would have missed. So it's good to put so much of data, so much of information in perspective, and definitely coming from your experience is always a pleasure. While we were talking, there were already questions, which were there about, the various aspects of budget. So I'll kind of, just go ahead with that thing. So, while we touched very briefly about, in the budget, there were some, measures in terms of controlling food inflation, and which has been a consistent worry. And we will have the RBI policy just, in the coming month itself. So how do you read this entire situation of the sticky food inflation? How do you think it will affect the impending RBI meeting? Your views on that.
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I must say that climate change is creating a big havoc in food prices and food management. A couple of data points. It doesn't rain in June anymore. Vegetable prices don't fall in winter anymore. Weather events like El Nino, which we've had every couple of years from the last 40, 50 years, which were associated with lower rainfall, now also come with heat waves. So there's a second angle to it that you have to be, prepared for. And this is just the start, honestly. I think climate change is going to continue to surprise us and particularly surprise our farmers. At this point of time, I think it's very, very sort of disturbing to see that food inflation is at 9%. Within that, vegetable inflation is at 30%. I think these are like really big numbers. Many prerequisites for rate cutting, by the RBI are getting met. Like, for example, the fiscal deficit is lower, something that the RBI is going to love, and I'm sure it's going to talk about it in a big way. The fact that the Fed is now more open to cutting rates. Markets are expecting a Fed rate cut in September. We have a Fed meeting in end July, where our house view is that the Fed may actually have some language and speak a little bit about and give some hints whether or not it's cutting in September. But it looks more likely if you were to trust the market expectations. So if other central banks are cutting, that makes it easier for the RBI to cut as well. Then RBI had been very worried about uncollateralized loans. That has also softened a little bit. So another problem that is sort of abated to some extent. Core inflation, which is non-food, non-fuel inflation, has almost halved in the last 1 year from 7% to 3.5%. And yet I think the RBI will not cut. And the reason is food inflation. The fact that food inflation is just so high, 9%, no central bank with 9% food inflation can cut rates. So that is the big problem. What can be done here? Look, I think there are many things, but one thing that this budget focused on was the price mechanism, the price adjustments, a buffer scheme. What is happening is that this government has been doing a lot of hard work on improving food logistics, buying, selling, importing, exporting, transporting from surplus areas to deficit areas. And in a way, it has been very, very nimble. And we sort of benefited from that in the last 5 to 8 years. But what we are seeing right now is coordinated shocks. That it's not just a bad production in India, but it's a bad production from everywhere India can import from. It's not just a bad production in South India, it's also bad production in North India. So when you have coordinated climate shocks, then you can't even import from here and export or buy from here and sell. And then just being nimble with logistics is not good enough. And I think creating better buffer stocks is now very, very important. We've traditionally had buffer stocks for rice and wheat. My sense is that has to be increased. And we also now need to start creating buffer stocks for other food items, even perishables like vegetables and milk. And by the way, all of that is possible now because of technology. Things like dehydration, freezing, all of that makes it possible to also store some of the perishable food items. So for the government to actually allocate some extra funds for that, I think was a good step. But we'll have to see, how I think eventually more money will be needed, and we'll have to see how they keep doing more and more. But for now, in terms of the RBI, expecting no change in the upcoming policy meeting.
Thank you for that, Pranjul. I'll go to the budget back again. I mean, since that's the main topic of discussion. So, in the light of I guess this was something that you also briefly mentioned when you were talking about the budget. So, it was a very well known fact that, we had this huge bumper dividend from RBI, and it was actually, considered quite high in decades, probably. And there was this expectation that, it might be used more towards capex or more towards spending, but they very tactfully used it to reduce fiscal deficit further, maintaining the trajectory and reducing the targets even further. So is this somewhere looking as a thought of line which is overly focused on maintaining and taking a very conservative stance? I mean, I do remember you mentioned in the earlier this thing that how fiscal deficit is important, but while earlier sometimes in the budget the collection or the targets that were mentioned, it was considered that the government was being aggressive, being tax buoyancy or other things. This time, is it actually leaning towards the other side? What do you think about it?
No, I don't think so. Because, when we look at our fiscal deficit, we need to think about not just the center, but also the states. So then you have a situation in which the center right now is, 4.9, say about 5%. States are close to about 3%. You have a consolidated fiscal deficit of 8%. And I'm not even counting the borrowing that our center and state public sector enterprises do. Because if I count that, then we actually go to about 10% of GDP. That's a lot of public sector borrowing that is happening in the economy. And if you put it in context, many emerging markets who are like India, for example, like India's level of GDP per capita, have lower fiscal deficits, have lower public debts. Today, interestingly and sadly, almost 50% of our tax revenues go to service the interest bill. So it leaves very little for other important expenditure like health, education, better infrastructure. So in order to be able to spend better in more productive sectors over time, you need to bring down your fiscal deficit. So much of your money doesn't get wasted in just paying the interest on the fiscal deficit, right? So that is the reason, with alongside many more, why over time we need to bring down the fiscal deficit. As in, I know it sounds irritating, like, why do people keep talking about fiscal consolidation? What does this even mean? It basically means that the government is picking up a larger chunk of savings that the economy has and not leaving a lot more for the private sector. And you need to leave a lot more for the private sector. Private sector really creates jobs and employs. So I think that is the the tall and short of it.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Pranjul. Coming back to private sector and the importance of that thing. So there have been a slew of measures in terms of job creating, upscaling, as well as, increasing probably the credit to MSMEs as well. More benefits for the new entrant to the job sector. So besides creating job and upskilling, is this somewhere really addressing, the situations faced by the MSME or the informal sector for that matter? Because I remember during the last conversation and some of, the discussions, you've really clearly stated how MSME sector is really important. So does it really address all the situations or to some extent a greater portion of the situations facing MSMEs?
Yeah. Look, as I said, that these are big challenges, and just one or two schemes in a budget can't change them. Because if they could, we would not have had these problems. The government would have quickly fixed them like a few years ago. I think what has happened with the MSMEs is that they've gone through back-to-back shocks, right? Like most recently, there's been the pandemic, then there's been the global, the oil price shock, and MSMEs suffer more when commodity prices suddenly go up. They don't have that much bargaining power as large firms have, and so there's just been back-to-back shocks, literally for the last couple of years. So look, we'll have to wait for that to come back up. Things like giving them better loans, it helps, but you also have to be very careful, because at some point you don't want the credit quality to suffer a lot, because that can have long-term implications for banks. So you need to really, tread the right path. I think eventually, if you want to really help MSMEs, you just need to do a ton of important reforms that makes ease of doing business in general easier, right? Like notifying the labor codes, land laws, to be easily access land, lowering the regulatory cholesterol, making it easier to comply for a lot of regulatory requirements, much better and easier access to credit, something that we're already doing. I think all of this needs, what we call ease of doing business, all of this needs to be improved more and more and more. And I think that eventually is what will help MSMEs. One or two announcements will not. I think just following up with lots of difficult reforms, I think, is something that will.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Pranjul. Also, going back to, something that you mentioned during the introduction, that there were some things which could have been there, more what was required from the budget and wasn't there. PLI, maybe some more additions out there, or disinvestment. If you could really be more, sharing further details about that thing, what is it that lacked in this budget? Because we've been reading a lot what has happened, but what could have also happened is something we would want to know more.
Yeah, sure. So look, as I mentioned, at some point it's important to get rid of your public sector enterprises, right? You created it for a reason. Maybe there was no private sector participation in a very important sector. You created it, it ran for a long time. But sometimes, not for all cases, but for some cases, it's better to basically put it back in the hands of the private sector when you have the confidence that the private sector can take care of it and perhaps even do a better job of it, right? Like today, why should we have the government building ship containers or motorbikes, right? Like at some point these kind of sectors can be privatized. And we had the biggest one, which was Air India, and the government actually got this big Air India disinvestment done when actually nobody was really expecting it, and that was amazing. It was such a complicated deal, but they got it done. And once they got it done, I thought that the machinery has gotten well oiled. If you've done the most complex disinvestment, some of the easier ones like Shipping Corporation of India, Container Corporation of India, all of that you can probably get done a little more easily, right? So it's a bit surprising that the government is not really talking about it right now in the budget. This is a great time to do it, given equity markets are so high. You would have got a great price for some of your stuff, but the government is not doing it. And if you speak to the people in that department, and the secretary's been giving a lot of interviews, one thing comes out very clearly, that they are focusing on improving the financials of many of these public sector enterprises rather than selling them at the current finances. Maybe they feel at some point they can do a better job. The government can get higher dividends from them, which has been a big source of revenue. My sense is it would be better off if they privatize, because if they privatize, then they get this money back, and they earn a pot of money, and they can use it for the next sector where the government should play a very important role, where the private sector is not ready. You have a pot of money, right? You keep churning it, right? You put it in a sector, you build some roads. As soon as that road is made, it's great. You give the loan to the private sector, the road to the private sector. You lease it out. You make another bunch of money, and from that you make another road, right? Then you give it to another private sector. You keep multiplying the impact of the same pot of money, right? And if you don't do privatization, you're just stuck with that pot of money. You're not being able to multiply the impact, and I think that is something that is missing.
Thank you. That's a very different way to look at privatization, because mostly it's looked upon as monetizing the asset, but definitely the government or the sovereign expertise or initiative might be required in certain areas which probably privates can't do, and there are something which privates can do and the government really doesn't need to take it beyond it. So it's important both the private and the PSU play their role and then leave it to the next person to do and take it next and take something better than that. So yeah, it's a beautiful way of looking at how interchangeably PSU and public privatization should be looked upon. Thank you so much for that. So I'll also kind of circle back to the question that we talked about inflation. Sorry, there was another question. So it was talking how about, you reading in terms of, the Fed policy actions and how does India align, we definitely do need to look at the domestic factors, but how do you think India would be aligned in case there's a Fed movement, or where do you see Fed taking action at this point in time?
Yeah, so look, for our own forecast, we are expecting, the first Fed rate cut in September. That's our house forecast. I think we've held it for a while, and now even the markets are converging towards that view. We have a Fed meeting coming up in end of July, where we think that the Fed will basically give more hints and perhaps lay out the path, which will eventually culminate into the September rate cut, because Fed likes to prepare the markets. That's from previous experience. That's what we've garnered, that Fed likes to prepare the market, and we're seeing rate cuts in many other advanced economy central banks, right? So the world is moving from a rate hiking to a rate cutting cycle, and I think that's also an opportunity to countries like India if they want to cut rates a little bit. So I think from that perspective, as I said, one of the big prerequisites for rate cuts are getting marked off, are getting ticked off for India, that the Fed is now cutting. Eventually, I think when food prices fall, food inflation falls, hopefully, rains do pick up in August. And at that point of time, instead of having a great harvest in September, October, we have a good harvest in October, November, or December. And finally, food prices come down, and then the RBI can cut rates as well. We are expecting two rate cuts of 25 basis points each, so 50 basis points in rate cuts by the RBI, one in the October to December quarter, and the other in the Jan to March quarter, taking the repo rate to 6% from 6.5% now. Now, one thing I want to point out here is we are not expecting a very deep rate cutting cycle. And I think we need to be very careful. Rate cuts don't mean lots of rate cuts. You can have just one or two rate cuts and you can stop. And that's probably a right thing to do as well, because if you cut rates too much, then again, inflation will start going up, and then you have to start hiking rates. And by the way, this is a problem which India has had for a very long time. We've had high growth rate in the past. We've grown at 8% in a few years, but we've never been able to sustain 8% for 10 to 20 years. Because every time we grow at about 8% for 1 or 2 years, we overheat. And then the RBI has to start hiking rates, and then the business cycle comes off and growth sort of falls back to about 6%, somewhere there. To have high growth for many years, you have to stop being greedy for more growth. You have to make sure that, fine, giving a lot of stimulus, monetary or what have you, but keep it a little, subdued. So you have strong growth, but you have strong growth for longer. And I think that is what we want to do. And in a way, I would say that is what makes you advanced economy, right? When we talk about Viksit Bharat is Bharat growing at 8% for 20 years. There's no other way of becoming a Viksit Bharat quickly. And for that, you have to keep an eye on things like, how much stimulus you're giving in terms of rate cuts. And it should never be too less or too much.
Yeah, consistent and long-term and stable growth is what we actually talk about, growth and Viksit Bharat, if you may say. With spurts of growth at a cost of maybe taking knee-jerk reactions is not something what we are looking at. Okay, point taken. So since we spoke about, earlier in the presentation, also you mentioned about, how, Capex is somewhere, more than current expenditure and current, somewhere highlights of this entire thing. So if we have to understand, like last year, I clearly remember it was like, calling it again and again, dexterous math. This time, it seems it's ticked the right boxes even better. So, for example, there have still been, cases of, capex being mentioned, fiscal prudence being mentioned, and various others. So, if you could really delve further, what were these key magical steps, I would say, if I may use that word, that kind of balances things. Like you are not compromising in growth and you are very fiscally prudent as well. If you could elaborate that further.
Yeah. I think one thing that I like, and I want to sort of, I did mention it, but I would love to repeat and sort of explain a little more, is how they are doing CapEx. We all want more CapEx, right? We want better infrastructure. We want more roads, rails. We want to get to places in a quicker way than we do. So we want that, right? But, it's not a snap of a finger. It needs a lot of implementation capability and capacity on the ground. It's not just about government doubling the CapEx budget. You need engineers, you need workers, you need material, you need quality controls, you need a lot of stuff behind it. And it takes time for that capacity to build up. Like I would say about 20 years ago, India was building 15 kilometers of highways per day. Today, we are building about 60 kilometers of highways per day, right? We've come a long way, but we've come a long way gradually. It's very hard to sort of raise it. So now, when the central government started doing a lot more capex than before, in the first 1 or 2 years, it focused only on roads and rails. That's where most of the outlays were increasing. But it can't increase more and more and more and more so quickly. And it was also time to move out and broaden out to other areas. And from that perspective, slowly, we've made many more projects gradually shovel ready more easily in many more sectors. So now urban development is coming up, housing is coming up. Construction has been a huge creator of jobs. You can call them low quality jobs, but they are still jobs. In the last year or two, there has been power sector capex that has gone up. And I think this is a really important step, that you're just not like one or two sector, like a one trick pony. You're more diversified. And I think we are now getting to that. So that's one. The second is, at some point, the state has to understand its limitations. India is but a combination of 27 states, and the states are closer to the ground, and the requirements of people on the ground can be far more than a rail line or a road, right? It can be many small things. It can be a small connecting road, it could be a well, it could be a small dam, it could be lots of things, and states can control that, center can't. So now what the center decided was that instead of stopping capex because we can't raise our capacity so quickly, we won't stop capex, but we start giving more money to states. So states can start doing capex, and they can do a very different kind of capex than we are doing. So we'll get even more diversified capex than before. And we started this 2 years ago, the center giving interest-free loans to states to do capex. And every single year, as this program has matured, the center is giving more and more interest-free loans to states, and even states are realizing how to get access and to use it in a prudent way. So now it's not just the center doing more capex, it's also the states doing more capex. Centers also being a little smart. They're not just giving out money freely. They're doing two things. One, they're saying, we'll give you more money if you don't lessen your own money that you're putting for capex, right? Because the worst would be centers giving and the state is not giving. So overall, it doesn't increase. So we'll give you, provided you don't lessen what you were giving. So then you have two sort of teams working together. That's one. The second, the center is saying that take access to my money, but in return, I have a few asks. Get one or two reforms done, and it has listed, a number of reforms. So I think this whole thinking about capex more broadly, more dynamically, I think is really something that that has been very out of the box thinking in the last 1 or 2 years.
Thank you. Thank you again for bringing that interesting point. Again, I guess it brings back to partnership. We need partnership between PSU and private, and we need a very more meaningful partnership between the state and central government as well, because each will have its own limitation and each will have its own advantageous positions that we can really fulfill. That's again good to know. Another thing, since we're talking about investment, we've talked about inflation, something that really comes a lot, in the discussions at this point in time is movement of goals, since we also talked about the import duty on on metals, etc. But how do you really see the asset has been completely like shining through past couple of months, and it doesn't seem to stop? What's your view on this entire movement of gold? I mean, we do understand there's geopolitical tension, but it's just reaching another level as far as gold movement is concerned. So how do you read that?
Well, look, I'm not a gold price expert, but yes, I think geopolitics has played a big role. Gold is gold. It really reacts to that. But I think what's more exciting about gold is the fact that the import tariff was cut. I think from a domestic perspective, I think that's very useful. Traditionally, India has been a big exporter of gems and jewelry. We've always been importers of gold because we don't have that much of raw gold with us. But once we import it, we have a lot of skilled workers who make a lot of products out of gold, all kinds of jewelry, and then we export it. It's a huge jobs intensive, skill intensive export market for India. Like if you look at the breakdown traditionally of India's exports. Now, back in 2013, we had to raise the import tariff on gold, but that time the macro environment was extremely different. What had happened that time was inflation had really sprung up. We had like CPI inflation at double digits at that point of time. And people were losing faith in financial assets and they were moving to physical assets. And the main physical asset had become gold. And there was huge import of gold. Trade deficit had ballooned. India was in the brink of a balance of payments crisis. And that's the time we put those tariffs. But we are not that anymore. The country is far more macroeconomically stable today. Inflation is down. Core inflation is 3.5%. We have a huge FX reserves. Our current account deficit has fallen. Our trade deficit has fallen. We are not actively seeing people moving away from financial assets to physical assets, especially gold. We are not seeing any semblance of that. So I think it was an opportunity at this point of time to bring down the import tariff and restart this big sector, gems and jewelry, which has been a big producer of jobs and exports. So I think we were opportunistic there. And by the way, if we keep reducing import tariffs in many goods where we've levied them in the last 10 years or so, I think we'll see same sort of impact. We'll see a lot of exports start off again, which we had been cutting back on.
Okay. Thank you for that answer again, Pranjul. I'll just take one last question. There are quite a few of them, but in just respect of time. So we talked about capex, we talked about various things, but when we finally boil down to certain key takeaways, we really talk about few sectors. I'm sure. I mean, they've talked about housing for rural and urban, so that's an obvious this thing. But if you have to look at three major or four major benefiters from this entire policy thrust, various measures that they have taken, which would be your top three sectors or your pick of choice, which you think will be the most benefited in this entire exercise of the budget?
Can I flip the question on its head if you don't mind?
Sure.
About a few sectors where we should have, in my view, focused, but we haven't. And I say this because I think if you really want to see if India is going to create those kind of jobs and grow in a fantastic way, we need at some point to have schemes and policies to impact a couple of jobs intensive sectors. And what again is something that I thought should be there. And hopefully we will pick back on it. What we have a once in a lifetime opportunity, which is this whole, you call it China plus one, you call it diversification of value chains and around the world. Now, we have been beneficiaries. If you see, India has gained global market share in the exports of several high-tech goods and services, mobile phones, drugs and pharma, automobile parts. Our services exports have moved up from being just call center, software solutions, to now selling professional services like legal, medical, HR, CA, all kinds of things. So these are like great sort of improvements. But we can't just focus on high-tech exports and high-tech FDI. We also need to woo mid-tech FDI. We need to get FDI, we need to get MNCs putting up plants in mid-tech sectors like textiles, food processing, leather, handbags, things like that, which are extremely jobs intensive. And we can see that value chains around the world are rejigging. So we should open ourselves out, right? Are we doing that enough? Maybe we are not. Can we? I think we can. And that's why I was very excited when the day before the budget, we got the economic survey, which made a point that we need to be far more open to FDI, for example, from China. Right? It is very important for us to be open to that because a lot of mid-tech manufacturing can come from there, and that can really, we're already doing for high tech, but we now need to also get down to mid-tech. So I think that is one thing. We made a sound of it in the economic survey, and we didn't see anything in budget, but I think it is a thought that is gaining steam, and I would watch out for that. Because then many sectors which have not yet participated in India's growth story, mid-tech jobs intensive sector, could start participating. And I think that is the area you should look out for. Don't look for sectors that have already run up. Look for sectors where you can see the seeds are getting sown and they could run up in the future. These mid-tech sort of employment schemes. Uh, we'll have to do a couple of things right. I think the first thing we need to do is bring down import tariffs and go out in the world and announce loudly and clearly that India believes in low import tariffs and we will keep it as stable as possible. That gives a lot of confidence to global value chain, right? Because global value chain is all about importing from somewhere, adding value and exporting. But if at some point you're constantly changing import prices, then this whole business model falls apart. So go out loudly and say, no, we are going to be extremely stable. That's number one. Number two, announce and go and finalize a lot of deep FTAs, free trade agreements with large countries or large blocks. We're already doing that. Our commerce minister is sort of traveling around the world, but do it quickly and do it well, like deep FTAs with many more goods and services. Open yourself out to many more markets. That's the second one. And the third one is a little more sort of controversial, but I would say that, we went out and said we want to give a manufacturing subsidy and we called it PLI, right? But then slowly over time, too many terms and conditions have crowded this PLI scheme, right? Today we are like, we'll give you the subsidy, but you have to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Like it becomes very hard. And one norm that is pretty hard for many MNCs is local sourcing norms. That in 2 years or 5 years, you have to do 30 or 50% of your sourcing locally. Now, this is very difficult for many MNCs because, when we ran a lot of surveys, many of them said that we don't have any visibility on our suppliers for over 2 years because of geopolitical changes around the world. How can we make a promise to you for 5 years, right? I think we need to make that a little easier. Only then we'll have many of these firms coming. And if the firms come over time, they will source locally. It's easier for them to source locally. But the ecosystem has to first get created and they need to get the confidence. So let's not, give all of these stringent norms too early on. Let it sort of come up with conversation over time. I think if we can do all of that, we can be huge winners in attracting not just high tech, but also mid tech investment. And then not just, make the rich richer, but also make a lot of the middle class and bottom of the pyramid richer, which move with more meaningful jobs, increase our manufacturing share, and so on and so forth. I think it's a huge opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much, Pranjul. I'm happy really you flipped the question and kind of, answered in a different way. So it's good to definitely know that, it's not just the high-tech exports which bring in the money, again, spreading it across, various kind of services, mid-tech, high-tech, low-tech. We want to cover the entire spectrum. We have captured the low-tech, we are evolving in the high-tech, but we want the mid-tech also to happen. Secondly, obviously, the job opportunities that we really need. We're talking so very evidently about the demographic dividend, but we need jobs for this population which is there in the working age group. So if you're not going to do that, we might as well just squander the opportunity available. So it's covering the entire spectrum, public-private partnership, center government partnership, and creating jobs for each and every person. So it really encapsulates the entire tick boxes that we need, to actually make this India growth story work. So thank you so much for that. I guess in the interest of time, I'll have to close this thing. We do have more questions, but I do understand we kind of running out of time. So thank you so much, Pranjul, for sharing it. It's always a pleasure to know because we read so much about budget, but if we have somebody putting it clearly in terms of what we are going to look at in terms of the positive and negative, it gives a much more clear perspective. So thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. Thank you and good day.
Very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you.